You wake up before dawn, lace yourself into a corset so tight you can barely breathe, and prepare for a day where your every move is dictated by someone else. This wasn't a nightmare. This was reality for millions of women in the 19th century. They were everywhere yet nowhere. In drawing rooms pouring tea with perfect grace, in factories working 16-hour shifts, in fields picking cotton under scorching sun. But here's the thing that will blow your mind. While society told them they were the weaker sex, these women were quietly holding up the entire world. Let me take you back to a time when a woman's worth was measured not by her dreams or talents, but by how silently she could suffer. The 19th century was an era of incredible contradictions. Steam engines were revolutionizing transportation, electricity was lighting up cities, and scientific discoveries were changing everything we knew about the world. Yet half the population, women, were expected to remain frozen in time, trapped in roles that hadn't changed for centuries. But here's where the story gets really interesting. While men were out there building railroads and founding industries, women were orchestrating their own quiet revolution. They were writing novels that would outlast empires, organizing the first labor strikes, and laying the groundwork for movements that would transform society forever. The most fascinating part, most of them never expected recognition. They weren't fighting for fame or glory. They were fighting for something much more precious, the right to exist as full human beings. Some succeeded against impossible odds. Others paid devastating prices for daring to dream. But every single one of them helped write the story we're living today. So when you think about the 19th century, don't just picture top hats and horse-drawn carriages. Picture Sarah, the factory girl who organized her first strike at 15. Picture Emma, the plantation woman who taught her children to read in secret by candlelight. Picture Margaret, the doctor's wife who performed surgeries when her husband was drunk, even though she'd never been allowed to attend medical school. These weren't just women living in the past. These were revolutionaries disguised as ordinary people, changing the world one small act of defiance at a time. And their story, it's about to get a whole lot more incredible than you ever imagined. Imagine being told from the moment you could walk that your entire future had already been decided. Not by your dreams, not by your talents, but simply by the fact that you were born female. In the 19th century, a woman's destiny was carved in stone before she even learned to speak. Marriage, motherhood, and a lifetime of quiet devotion to keeping house. They called her the angel of the house, but angels, as we know, are meant to be seen and not heard. A proper 19th century woman was expected to glide through life like a ghost in silk, beautiful, pure, and utterly silent about her own desires. Her virtue wasn't measured by her intelligence or kindness, but by three simple things: how well she obeyed, how quietly she suffered, and how perfectly she could embroider a handkerchief. Picture Mary, a typical middle-class woman in 1850. She wakes up at 5 in the morning, not because she wants to, but because the house demands it. Before anyone else stirs, she's already lighting fires, checking on the servants, and planning meals for a family that will never ask what she might want to eat. Her day revolves around everyone else's needs, while her own slowly disappear like morning mist. But here's what's absolutely fascinating, and heartbreaking at the same time. Behind those perfectly pressed curtains and polished tea sets, many women were quietly suffocating. They had dreams, ambitions, thoughts that went far beyond choosing the right china pattern. Yet they learned to smile and nod while their souls screamed for something more. And you know what they did about it? They got creative in ways that would surprise you. Some women discovered that a well-timed fainting spell could get them out of tedious social obligations. These parlor faints became so common that furniture makers actually started designing special chairs with extra arm supports to catch falling ladies. Can you imagine that? Society was so restrictive that women literally had to pretend to lose consciousness just to escape boring dinner parties. But it gets even more interesting. These fainting episodes weren't always fake. Those corsets that squeezed women's waists down to 18 or 19 inches, about the size of a large pizza, actually made it hard to breathe properly. So while some women were faking faints to escape social prison, others were genuinely passing out from lack of oxygen. Fashion was literally stealing their breath away. The saddest part, many women began to believe this was all they deserved. They convinced themselves that wanting more was selfish, that dreaming beyond the kitchen and nursery was somehow ungrateful. They became complicit in their own imprisonment, teaching their daughters the same lessons of silence and submission. Yet even in this golden cage, some refused to have their spirits broken. They found tiny acts of rebellion, reading forbidden books hidden inside their sewing baskets, writing letters that revealed their true thoughts, or simply taking long walks where they could think their own thoughts without interruption. The home was supposed to be their kingdom, but for many 19th century women it felt more like a beautiful prison where they served a life sentence for the crime of being born female. While society kept telling women, "Your place is in the home," some extraordinary souls decided to write their own rules instead. These weren't just any women. These were the rebels, the dreamers, the ones who looked at the world and said, "This isn't good enough." Let me tell you about Mary Wollstonecraft, a woman so ahead of her time that her ideas are still giving people chills today. Picture this. It's 1792, and most women can't even own property or get a decent education. Then along comes Mary with a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and she basically drops a literary bomb on society. Mary didn't just suggest that women deserved better, she demanded it. She argued that women weren't naturally inferior to men, they were just denied the same opportunities. She believed that if you gave a woman the same education as a man, she could achieve just as much. Revolutionary? Absolutely. Scandalous? You bet. The book caused such an uproar that people called her everything from a hyena in petticoats to an unsexed female. But here's the beautiful part. That book lit a fire that would burn for generations. Fast forward to the mid-1800s, and you've got women all over Europe and America picking up Mary's torch. They called themselves suffragettes, and they had one simple, radical demand: the right to vote. Sounds reasonable now, right? Back then it was considered so outrageous that grown men would literally throw rotten eggs at women just for suggesting it. But these women? They were tougher than anyone imagined. When Emily Davison threw herself in front of the King's horse at the Derby in 1913, she wasn't just making a statement, she was willing to die for the cause. And she did. Her funeral procession stretched for miles, with thousands of women marching in white, carrying banners that read, "Fight on, and God will give the victory." The authorities tried everything to break these rebels. They arrested them for disturbing the peace, when all they did was ask for basic human rights. They threw them in prison cells meant for hardened criminals. And when the women went on hunger strikes to protest their treatment, the government's response was absolutely brutal. They forced tubes down their throats and poured liquid food into their stomachs while they were held down by guards. Can you imagine the courage it took to face that? These women knew they'd be force-fed, knew they'd be ridiculed in newspapers, knew their families might disown them, but they kept showing up. Every beating, every arrest, every cruel cartoon in the papers just made them more determined. Here's what blows my mind about these rebels. They weren't just fighting for themselves. Most of the suffragette leaders were educated, middle-class women who could have lived comfortable, quiet lives. But they looked around and saw factory girls working 16-hour days with no protection, saw women trapped in abusive marriages with no legal recourse, saw brilliant minds wasted simply because they belonged to female bodies. And the writers, the writers were just as rebellious as the protesters, maybe more so. They smuggled revolutionary ideas into romance novels and social commentary. George Eliot had to use a male pen name just to get published, but once her books hit the shelves, she was changing minds one reader at a time. Charlotte Bronte created Jane Eyre, a character so independent and strong-willed that Victorian readers didn't know what to do with her. These women turned words into weapons and books into battlegrounds. They proved that sometimes the most powerful revolution happens not in the streets, but in the quiet moment when someone reads something that changes how they see the world forever. The beautiful irony? Society tried to silence these rebels, but every attempt to shut them up just amplified their voices. Every arrest made headlines, every force-feeding created sympathy, every banned book became more precious because it was forbidden. They didn't just want the vote, they wanted to rewrite the entire story of what it meant to be a woman in the world. Here's the truth that history books often skip over. While we talk about the angel of the house ideal, millions of women never had the luxury of staying home. For them, the 19th century wasn't about choosing between marriage and career, it was about surviving another day. Let me paint you a picture that might shock you. It's 6 in the morning in a textile mill in Manchester, England. The machines are already roaring, filling the air with cotton dust so thick you can barely see across the room. And working those machines? Girls who should be playing with dolls, some as young as 12 years old, already putting in 16-hour shifts that would break grown men. These weren't isolated cases. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of women and girls across Europe and America. The Industrial Revolution promised progress, but it was built on the backs of people who had no choice but to work or starve. Factory owners loved hiring women and children because they could pay them a fraction of what they'd pay men. A skilled male worker might earn 15 shillings a week, while a woman doing similar work would be lucky to get 4. But if you think factory work was hard, let me tell you about the women whose stories were even more heartbreaking. On plantations across the American South, enslaved women lived a nightmare that most people can't even imagine. They worked the fields from sunrise to sunset and then faced a horrific reality that makes your heart break. They were forced to bear children who would be sold away from them like cattle. Picture Sarah, an enslaved woman on a cotton plantation in Georgia. She's not just property, she's what slaveholders called a breeder. Her children aren't hers to raise or love freely. They're future investments, human beings with price tags. The masters would literally calculate how many children she could produce and factor that into her value as property. The cruelty is almost impossible to comprehend. These women, factory workers, enslaved mothers, domestic servants, they were the invisible engine that powered the entire economy. While wealthy ladies worried about which dress to wear to the opera, working women were literally keeping society running with their bare hands. But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. In 1848, something extraordinary happened in Lowell, Massachusetts. The mill girls there, young women who worked those crushing 16-hour days, decided they'd had enough. But here's what makes this so powerful. They weren't asking for huge pay raises or shorter hours. They were asking for something much more fundamental. They wanted to be treated like human beings. The Lowell Mill Girls, as they became known, organized one of the first major strikes by women workers in American history. These were young women, many barely out of their teens, standing up to powerful mill owners who could ruin their lives with a single decision. They published their own newspaper called The Lowell Offering, where they wrote about their experiences and dreams. They proved that even exhausted, overworked girls could think, organize, and fight back. What's amazing is how they saw themselves. They didn't accept that being poor meant being worthless. In their newspaper, they wrote poetry, discussed literature, and shared their hopes for the future. They were determined to prove that just because they worked with their hands didn't mean they couldn't think with their minds. The strike itself was a sight to behold. Imagine hundreds of young women, still in their work clothes, marching through the streets of Lowell, singing hymns and carrying signs that read, "We will not be slaves." They faced ridicule from newspapers that called them hysterical and unnatural. Factory owners threatened to blacklist anyone who participated, but they marched anyway. The strike didn't give them everything they wanted. Few strikes ever do. But it did something more important. It showed the world that working women had voices, had dignity, and wouldn't be silent anymore. Word spread to other factory towns, and soon women workers across New England were organizing their own protests. Here's something that will blow your mind. Many of these women had to hide their organizing activities in the most creative ways. They would tear pages out of books, sometimes even Bibles, and write secret messages about meeting times and strike plans. Then they'd pass these hidden notes through their networks, right under the noses of supervisors who were watching for any sign of trouble. These weren't just labor disputes. These were declarations of human worth. Every woman who walked off her job, every enslaved mother who secretly taught her child to read, every mill girl who wrote a poem about her dreams, they were all saying the same thing. I am more than my circumstances. I am more than what you've made me. I am human. And you know what's incredible? Many of these women never lived to see the changes their courage would bring. But their daughters and granddaughters inherited a different world, one where a woman's worth wasn't measured only by her silence and suffering, but by her strength and determination to demand better. The next time someone talks about the good old days, remember these invisible women who built the modern world with their calloused hands and unbreakable spirits. Did you know that many women used the pages of forbidden books to hide revolutionary messages? If you're loving this journey through hidden history, hit that like button, share this with someone who appreciates untold stories, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more incredible tales from the past. Tell me in the comments, Which 19th century woman inspires you the most? Picture walking into a doctor's office in 1850 and being told that your entire personality, your intelligence, even your ability to think clearly, was controlled by one organ in your body. Not your brain, your uterus. This wasn't some backwoods superstition. This was official medical science in the 19th century. Doctors back then had a fascinating theory about women that would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. They believed that women were essentially walking wombs with legs, and that this mysterious organ could literally wander around inside their bodies, causing all sorts of problems. Feeling sad? Blame the uterus. Acting too independent? Definitely the uterus. Wanting to read books or have opinions? Well, that uterus of yours must be acting up again. They had a name for this supposed condition, hysteria. The word actually comes from the Greek word for uterus, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they took women's mental health. If a woman displayed any behavior that didn't fit the perfect angel of the house mold, if she was too emotional, too intellectual, too anything really, doctors would nod knowingly and declare her hysterical. The treatments they prescribed would shock you. Some doctors genuinely believed that marriage would cure hysteria, because apparently having a husband would somehow put that wandering uterus back in its proper place. Others recommended immediate pregnancy, as if having a baby would suddenly make a woman's brain work properly. But here's where the story gets really strange and uncomfortable. Many physicians of the era prescribed what they called pelvic massage as a medical treatment. Picture this: serious medical men in dark coats and spectacles, treating what they saw as a legitimate medical condition through manual stimulation. They approached this with the same clinical detachment they might use to set a broken bone, completely missing the obvious reasons why their patients seemed to feel better afterward. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. In the 1880s, a doctor named Joseph Mortimer Granville got tired of performing these treatments by hand. Apparently it was giving him muscle cramps. So he invented a mechanical device to do the job for him. The first electromechanical vibrator was born, not as a pleasure device, but as what doctors genuinely believed was serious medical equipment. The irony is almost too perfect. These male doctors, who insisted that women were too delicate and irrational to be trusted with important decisions, accidentally stumbled onto something that would eventually become a symbol of female empowerment and independence. They thought they were curing a disease caused by a wandering uterus, when they were actually just helping women discover their own bodies. What makes this even more fascinating is how the medical establishment completely missed what was really happening. For decades, they continued to prescribe these treatments with straight faces, writing detailed medical papers about the therapeutic benefits of pelvic massage for hysteria. They created elaborate theories about nervous disorders and uterine displacement, never once stopping to consider that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't with women's bodies, but with society's expectations. Meanwhile, the women themselves often played along with this medical theater, because it was one of the few socially acceptable ways to experience pleasure in a society that told them their desires didn't matter. They would schedule regular appointments with their doctors, discussing their symptoms with the same seriousness that men might discuss a heart condition. The really tragic part is how this medical misunderstanding reinforced terrible ideas about women's capabilities. If women were truly controlled by their reproductive organs, then obviously they couldn't be trusted with voting, running businesses, or making important decisions. The medical establishment was essentially providing scientific backing for keeping women powerless. But some women weren't fooled. There were female doctors fighting to enter the profession, like Elizabeth Blackwell, who became the first woman to earn a medical degree in America in 1849, despite being accepted to medical school only because the male students thought it would be funny to let a woman in. These pioneering women physicians brought a completely different perspective to women's health, one that actually listened to what women were saying about their own bodies. The vibrator story gets even more interesting as we move into the 20th century. By the 1920s, these devices were being advertised in respectable women's magazines as health and beauty aids. Women could buy them through mail-order catalogs, right alongside vacuum cleaners and sewing machines. The medical community had moved on to other theories about women's health, leaving their therapeutic devices to find new purposes in the consumer market. Looking back, it's almost incredible how confidently 19th century medicine spoke about women's bodies, while understanding so little about them. They created elaborate theories, expensive treatments, and specialized equipment, all based on the assumption that women were fundamentally broken versions of men. The real tragedy wasn't just the bad medicine. It was how this medical approach gave scientific credibility to the idea that women couldn't be trusted to understand their own experiences. If a woman said she was unhappy with her restricted life, doctors could dismiss her feelings as symptoms of hysteria. If she wanted more education or independence, that was just her uterus talking. These medical theories didn't exist in a vacuum. They were part of a larger system that needed women to be seen as naturally inferior, naturally in need of male guidance and control. And sadly, many women internalized these ideas, believing that their desires for something more than domestic life were actually signs of sickness. The 19th century was supposed to be the age of scientific progress, but when it came to understanding women, science got it spectacularly wrong. While men were writing grand epics about wars and heroes, some of the most dangerous revolutionaries of the 19th century were sitting quietly in parlors, armed with nothing but ink and paper. These women discovered something that would change the world forever. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or a gun. It's a well-crafted sentence that makes people think. Let me tell you about Jane Austen, who might just be the most subversive writer you've never fully appreciated. On the surface, her novels seem perfectly harmless. Stories about young women finding husbands, exactly what society expected female writers to produce. But here's the brilliant part. Jane was playing a game of literary hide-and-seek, using wit and irony to expose everything that was wrong with her world. Take Pride and Prejudice. Most people read it as a romance, but Jane was actually writing a devastating critique of a society that treated women like commodities in a marriage market. When she wrote about women needing to marry for financial security, she wasn't celebrating it. She was showing how absurd and cruel the whole system was. Every elegant sentence was a tiny rebellion disguised as entertainment. The genius of writers like Jane was that they could say things that would get them ostracized if spoken directly. They wrapped their revolutionary ideas in beautiful prose and charming characters, smuggling dangerous thoughts right past the censors and into the hearts of readers who didn't even realize they were being radicalized. But publishing wasn't easy for women, even when they were writing acceptable subjects. Here's a story that will blow your mind. Charlotte Brontë had to publish Jane Eyre under the male pen name Currer Bell because publishers literally told her that books by women don't sell. Can you imagine? One of the greatest novels in English literature almost never saw daylight because of pure sexism. And Charlotte wasn't alone. Her sisters Emily and Anne also used male pen names, Ellis and Acton Bell. The three Brontë sisters basically created an entire fictional family of male authors just to get their work published. The irony is delicious. These supposedly inferior female brains produced literature that's still being read and studied more than a century later, while most of the superior male writers of their era have been completely forgotten. But wait, the story gets even better. When Jane Eyre became a huge success, people started speculating about the mysterious Currer Bell. Some critics praised the book's masculine power and strong male perspective. Others suspected it might be written by a woman because it showed too much understanding of female emotions. Charlotte must have laughed herself silly reading those reviews. The book itself was revolutionary in ways that still make people uncomfortable today. Jane Eyre was nobody's angel of the house. She was poor, plain, and absolutely refused to be anyone's doormat. When the man she loves tries to make her his mistress, she walks away rather than compromise her principles. For 1847, this was radical stuff. Now, let's talk about a completely different kind of female artist, the women who turned seduction into an art form and espionage into a career. While novelists were fighting battles with words, women like Mata Hari were proving that a beautiful woman could be more dangerous than an entire army. Mata Hari wasn't even her real name. She was born Margaretha Geertruida Zell in the Netherlands, but she reinvented herself as an exotic dancer and courtesan, moving through the highest levels of European society during World War I. The fascinating thing about Mata Hari is that she understood something that male spies often missed. People will tell you their secrets if they think you're not smart enough to understand them. She used society's own prejudices against it. Men assumed that a beautiful dancer couldn't possibly be intelligent enough to be a real threat, so they talked freely around her, sharing military secrets and political gossip, while she smiled and appeared to pay attention only to jewels and champagne. But Mata Hari was filing away every piece of information, every careless comment, every strategic detail. The tragic irony is that Mata Hari was probably never the master spy her legend claims. She was likely just a woman trying to survive in a world that offered limited options for female independence. But when the war went badly and people needed someone to blame, she became the perfect scapegoat, exotic, foreign, and dangerously beautiful. What's absolutely fascinating is how these two types of women, the writers and the spies, were using the same basic strategy. They were taking advantage of how society underestimated them. Publishers thought women couldn't write serious literature, so female authors slipped profound ideas past them, disguised as romance novels. Military officers thought beautiful women were too frivolous to be dangerous, so female spies gathered intelligence while pretending to care only about fashion and flirtation. Both groups understood that sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight. Jane Austen could criticize the entire social system as long as she wrapped her criticism in elegant prose and happy endings. Mata Hari could move through diplomatic circles gathering secrets as long as she played the part of the dizzy entertainer. The really brilliant part is how these women turned their supposed weaknesses into strengths. Society said women were too emotional to write objectively. Female novelists used that emotion to create characters so real they jumped off the page. Society said women were naturally deceptive and untrustworthy. Female spies used those stereotypes to become invisible in a world of secrets. These artistic revolutionaries proved something that terrified the establishment. Give women access to words, ideas, and opportunities, and they don't just succeed, they excel. They don't just participate in culture, they reshape it. They don't just tell stories, they change how people see the world. The saddest part is how many brilliant women we probably lost, because they never got the chance to pick up a pen or step onto a stage. For every Jane Austen whose work survived, how many other potential literary geniuses spent their lives in silent frustration, their stories dying with them? But the ones who did break through, they didn't just open doors for themselves, they blew those doors clean off their hinges for everyone who came after. So here we are at the end of this incredible journey through the lives of 19th century women, and I have to ask you something. Doesn't it feel like we've been looking at history through a completely different lens? The 19th century wasn't just the age of steam engines and industrial progress. It was the century when half the world's population began their long march toward freedom. Think about the contradictions we've uncovered together. While some women were literally forbidden from learning to read, others were writing novels that would outlast empires. While factory girls were working themselves to exhaustion for pennies, suffragettes were organizing movements that would reshape democracy itself. While doctors were declaring women too fragile to think clearly, female spies were outwitting entire military establishments. It's almost like there were two completely different worlds existing side by side. The official world where women were supposed to be silent and submissive, and the hidden world where they were quietly becoming some of the most powerful forces for change in human history. Every single woman we've talked about today, from the mill girls of Lowell to the pen-wielding rebels like Charlotte Bronte, they were all fighting the same fundamental battle. They were saying in 1,000 different ways, "I am more than what you've decided I should be." And you know what's absolutely mind-blowing? Most of them never lived to see how completely they would win that fight. The woman lacing herself into a suffocating corset every morning in 1850 couldn't have imagined that her great-granddaughter would be voting, going to university, and choosing her own career. The factory girl organizing that first strike in Lowell had no idea she was laying the groundwork for labor rights that would protect millions of workers. The enslaved mother teaching her child to read by candlelight couldn't have dreamed that education would become a right, not a privilege stolen in secret moments. These weren't just individual stories of courage. They were threads in a tapestry that was slowly but surely reweaving the entire fabric of society. Every time a woman picked up a forbidden book, every time she said no to an unwanted marriage, every time she demanded to be paid fairly for her work, she was adding another thread to that tapestry. But here's what really keeps me up at night thinking about this. How many stories are we still missing? How many brilliant women lived and died in complete obscurity, their dreams buried with them? How many diaries were burned? How many letters were destroyed? How many incredible achievements were simply forgotten because nobody thought women's lives were worth recording. Imagine all the 19th century women whose names we'll never know, the ones who invented things but couldn't get, patents who wrote poetry that was thrown away, who had scientific insights that were dismissed, who led communities but were never mentioned in any official records. The stories we've shared today are just the tip of the iceberg. The real tragedy isn't just what these women endured, it's all the genius and creativity that was lost forever, because society didn't think it was worth preserving. And yet, and this is the beautiful part, somehow the most important changes survived. Somehow, despite all the obstacles and all the attempts to silence them, enough women broke through to change everything. The vote they fought for became reality. The education they demanded became available. The independence they dreamed of became possible. When you cast a vote, when you choose your career, when you speak your mind without asking permission, you're living the dreams of women who died believing those things might never be possible. You're the answer to prayers whispered by women who thought they were fighting hopeless battles. The 19th century taught us something incredible. Progress isn't always loud and dramatic. Sometimes the most important revolutions happen quietly, one person at a time, one small act of courage building on another, until suddenly the whole world has changed. These women didn't just fight for themselves, they fought for you, for your daughters, for every woman who would come after them. They planted trees whose shade they would never enjoy, and we're still benefiting from their sacrifices today. But the story isn't over. Every generation has to fight its own battles, face its own contradictions, and push the boundaries a little further. The women of the 19th century handed us a world that was better than the one they inherited, and now it's our turn to do the same for the people who come after us. History isn't just something that happened in the past. It's something we're writing right now, every single day, with every choice we make and every stand we take. If this journey through hidden history has opened your eyes to the incredible power of untold stories, show some love by hitting that like button and sharing this with anyone who appreciates the real heroes of the past. Subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more epic adventures through history's most fascinating chapters. Until next time, because history never stops being written and neither do we,